Smart. Okay, feel free, take one, pass the rest on. So, thank you. Here's why we're here and how we're here and so on. So, when Jenny became pregnant with Zafra, I realized how important it was for me to get my thoughts on Judaism and the environment and collate them and turn them into a book. Now Zafra's become bat mitzvah, and I'm still only part of the way there. That is what happens when you're a full-time rabbi, I guess, and parent and husband and everything else. In my sabbatical in 2022, whoops, let's let Crystal in. In my sabbatical in 2022, I at least compiled all my notes, and it was about 30,000 type pages. It was a stupid number of type pages from hundreds and hundreds of books over a decade and a half. And so the question really is how to compile this and how to bring it all together. And so the idea here is to what you're looking at, what we're going to look at today, and there will be 4 sessions over the year. What we're going to look at today is some of the thoughts on one of the topics that will form part of a chapter. And so the idea is for me to share my thoughts, which are not yet fully collated, and by having this recorded, actually get to transcribe it as well, which is much easier. So there are different sections in this handout, and the idea is that I invite you basically at the end of each section, and each section is done by the headings, the bold typed headings, and I invite you to share thoughts, questions, comments, and so on. Not necessarily after each text, because I think we won't get through it all if we do that, but at the end of each section, essentially. Oh, let's let Noah in as well. There we go. Just make sure Noah's in. There we go. Okay, so what I have to do is I have to share my screen for those. This is the challenge. There we go. For those who are here, I have to multitask on Zoom. Okay. Can everyone who's online, can you see that's okay?
Yes.
Okay. And what I really want to do is full screen, but there you go. Okay, so the blessing before study is la'asok b'divrei Torah, thanks God who commands us to engage in the study of our tradition. And some of us said it in the morning service. If not, it's fine, it's good. It's a chance to say another blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So let's start with the picture, which I found, and I rather enjoyed this picture. I don't know if anybody has ever actually been up close to a lion before, really up close. We did when it was Jenny's 30th, and we went to London Zoo, and we were zookeepers for the day, and they did a sort of clicker training with lions, which is extraordinary, and you're in a cage, and basically they get the lion to come right up and to stand on its hind legs and to put its arms onto the cage, its forearms onto the cage, so that they can check for ticks and everything like that. And it was quite beyond terrifying when you are a foot from a lion, even behind a cage, where you realize the enormity of a lion and the absolute power of a lion. And so this picture is fascinating for me. It's not part of the book in any way, but it's fascinating in terms of the strength of Samson, who fights the lion, and how weak the lion seems in the face of human strength and human ability, and how obviously the story of Samson defeating the lion is a story about his immense strength. But I find it fascinating, just as in a visual perspective, to see how small this lion is and how weak this lion is compared to this man. I don't think this picture necessarily shows off Samson's strength when the lion is so much smaller than him, but I'm not going to focus on the art so much. This isn't an art excursus. So let's start with There is no one Jewish voice. This is really important. There are tendencies in Judaism, and those tendencies are often through different ages or different modes of thought, but not necessarily. It's quite difficult to say Judaism says. However, there are mainstream voices in Judaism. And so the first quotation that I have here, the idea that a single determinative ancient Israelite worldview can be discerned must also be treated with caution, since the diverse literary styles and dates of the biblical texts suggest at the very least the possibility of development and fluidity and even of multiple world views. So we have to be really careful from the very beginning when we turn around and say Torah says or the Bible says. Because, for example, if you take the prophet Isaiah, there are 3 different authors in the book of Isaiah. And you might be able to turn around and say, but the compiler, the editor, at least gives us a structured worldview by including these 3 authors. But nonetheless, we don't want to simplify and say, well, okay, then they're all essentially one worldview. Because it's possible for each text to have a multiplicity of worldviews, particularly on our place in the world. So even though it can be said that there is no systematic Jewish thought, there is at least a Jewish tendency regarding the difference between humans and nature. That's where we're going to start. Are we different from the rest of nature? So we start with Midrash. Let me scroll down, because I have to multitask. We start with Midrash from Genesis Rabbah. Rabbi Yehoshua bar Nehemiah said in the name of Rabbi Hanina bar Yitzchak, and the rabbis in the name of Rabbi Elazar say, God endowed Adam with 4 features from the supernal realm, that's the realm above, and 4 features from the lower realm. From the lower realm, Adam eats and drinks as does an animal, procreates as does an animal, defecates as does an animal, and dies as does an animal. From the supernal realm, the realm above, Adam stands as do the ministering angels, speaks as do the ministering angels, has intelligence as do the ministering angels, and sees as do the ministering angels. And then you have a little commentary that says, hold on a minute, don't the animals also see? This is fairly bewildering. And the response is, the difference is that human beings have peripheral vision. So for those who know their biology, you'll know that there are animals that definitely have peripheral vision. And I think this is a really interesting rabbinic commentary, because we have to be really careful of how much did they actually know about the world. And so when we're talking about Judaism and our place in the world, there are times their cosmology, for example, is clearly an ancient cosmology. Their understanding of biology is clearly questionable. 204, let's get this right, 248 bones or sinews in a man and 252 in a woman, for example. Sometimes they clearly cut up cadavers to check. Sometimes they really had no idea what they were talking about. And the idea that animals don't have peripheral vision at least gives us an opportunity to be slightly skeptical about rabbinic commentary. Nonetheless, even with our skepticism, this midrash is pointing out something important, that we are both we are both animal and angel. We are part of each. We have tendencies like the tendencies of animals, the tendencies to defecate, to procreate and everything else. And we also have the ability of the higher beings, such as speaking, intelligence, and so on. And we can come back to what does that mean? What does intelligence mean? What does communication mean? What does speech mean? Certainly the idea that we have here feeds into this idea of the great chain of being. The great chain of being, which comes from Plato and others as well, is an ancient worldview which is structured in order. God is at the top, then the angels, or something similar, then humanity, divided man and then woman, and there clearly is in ancient biblical thought and in rabbinic thought a hierarchy. So God, angels, man, woman, the animals, and then other parts of nature that are alive, trees, shrubs, and so on, and then the inanimate parts of nature. And so human beings, according to ancient Jewish perspective, find ourselves in the middle of two, in between the angels and the animals. And so rabbinic commentary, early Judaism picked up on this idea of we're neither one nor the other, but a bit of both. And we have the ability to choose which one we get closest to. We have free will. And that leads us into the next text, which is quoted by Martin Buber. Said the Holy Blessed One, I have no satisfaction from these creatures. It's nothing, this is the angels. It's nothing significant if the angels do my will, since they have no evil inclination. And I am not obliged to reward them, since they have only a good inclination. From the beasts too I derive no satisfaction, since they have only an evil inclination and therefore cannot be punished. I shall create a creature then, so that both evil and good inclinations will enter them and will struggle against one another. And if the good will control the evil, it will be well for them. If the evil will control the good, it will be ill for them. So what we're talking about is a rather fascinating worldview. And I mentioned this in my pre-Shabbat message in terms of, does your pet have free will? And hopefully, since then, you've been looking at your pet and assessing, are they doing this out of choice or out of compulsion? Because according to rabbinic perspective, the verb vayitzer that is used in creation tells us something important. If you have a look in Torah, and if you want, you can grab a chumash. If you have a look, when the animals are created, the verb vayitzer has only one yud. And when human beings are created, the verb vayitzer has two yuds. It's exactly the same word, meaning God formed, but it's spelled differently. So the rabbis say, aha, there must be a reason for this different spelling. It's pointing to something to teach us about the angels and about the beasts and about human beings. The beasts have only one yetzer, only one inclination, one tendency, whereas human beings have two, the positive inclination, the negative inclination. Now, in Hebrew, they call the yetzer hatov the yetzer hara, which is literally the good inclination and the evil inclination. But then, if you turn around and say animals have only the evil inclination, most people who own pets lose their mind at you. And I had that once in a presentation, when I was a teenager, and somebody was furious at me. And I said, this is just the rabbinic perspective. The yetzer hara is not evil per se, because rabbinic Judaism says that if it weren't for the yetzer hara, then a person wouldn't build a house, wouldn't get married, and wouldn't procreate. So really, the better way to look at it is the angelic inclination and the animalistic inclination. The inclination to transcend the physical and the inclination to be completely engrossed in the physical. And so, according to this midrash quoted by Martin Buber, angels, God is bored by angels because they only do good. And so they're only inclined to do good. So there's no reward or punishment. And similarly, the beasts, the animals in this world, only have the inclination to take care of themselves. However we understand that. That could be their kin, their tribe, their family, and so on. But essentially to only follow, eat, procreate, poop, and so on. That's what, in the rabbinic mind, that's all animals do. They don't have culture in any way. And they are only ever following their instincts, their immediate instincts. However, so God basically says, on one end of the spectrum is boring, on the other end of the spectrum is boring. I need something in between. I need something that chooses and can choose from the double yud, from the good inclination or from the lofty inclination or from the animalistic inclination. And so what this is suggesting in the rabbinic mind is we are profoundly different from all other species on Earth. That all other species only follow that which they know how to do, or that which they instinctively do. Whereas we have a choice to transcend if we wish. And so we can go up or down. And that's essentially what Yom Kippur is about the times when we went more to our base inclination rather than our lofty inclination. So we can even, this isn't just in rabbinic thought. Descartes, for example, said that animal consciousness is a prejudice to which we are accustomed from our earlier years. In other words, Descartes said, yeah, I know you look at your dog and you think your dog is loving you and your dog is being friendly and your dog is making a choice. Descartes says that's because you're still thinking like a child. In fact, he says that animals are nothing more than automata, that they are not really in a conscious state, perhaps. They are incapable of consciousness, including, said Descartes, including feeling pain. He said, according to Descartes, animals can't even feel pain. And that's obviously ridiculous. That's obviously nonsensical. But I think it points out a real problem with ordering nature in hierarchy, which is that we become sympathetic to those who are on the same level as us and less sympathetic to those who are below. And so you can turn around and you can say, well, these animals, they're not really conscious, they're just doing that which they are inclined to do. So even if you hurt an animal or seem to hurt an animal and the animal responds, it's not actually registering pain, it's just responding out of instinct. We know, of course, animals feel pain. Of course we do. But I think it's important for us to flag that this isn't just Judaism that has said that there is very much an order to creation. Let's scroll down to the next text, if I may.
But isn't Descartes just the product of the whole Judeo-Christian thing that was going on for 3,000 years before him? I mean, yeah, he says this, and I've heard this before, and I said a lot of crap this is, and even took a course on him in college.
Okay.
That's all I'm going to say.
No, I appreciate the question. So is Descartes just a product of the Judeo-Christian mindset?
It's just the mirror.
So I would say, is he reflecting back that which you said? Firstly, I'll flag the whole concept of Judeo-Christian. I don't think such a thing exists. I think Judeo-Christian is often created by supersessionists who believe that Judaism naturally led into Christianity, and so Judaism was absorbed into Christianity. And I think Judaism and Christianity have very differing worldviews. Although, I will say that I think Judaism was very strongly influenced by Hellenism and Christianity into splitting body and soul. And I think that is extremely problematic when it comes to environmental ethics. Because then what happens is we become less concerned about the body and physicality and presence and much more concerned with eternal life. And so we are less likely to try to protect this earth because it doesn't really matter. Because the real essence of a person and the real essence of connection with God is after this earth. So you're less likely to. Certainly the perspective you're sharing is similar to that of Lynn White, who in 1973, maybe, wrote a paper called the Religious Roots of Our Environmental Crisis. And Lynn White was very clear that the Bible is responsible for the way we think and for environmental destruction because of the opening chapters of Genesis. And I understand where that perspective comes from, but if you look at, for example, Easter Island, where they didn't have access to the Bible and still destroyed their entire ecosystem, I think it's easy. I think it's important for us to distinguish. Maybe Descartes is reflecting that, or maybe Descartes is reflecting a larger social thing of whenever, regardless of biblical or not, of when human beings see themselves as above nature or separated from nature, they are more likely to turn nature into something utilitarian, something that they use as opposed to something that they appreciate. And similarly, they are more likely to denigrate it and therefore less likely to protect it. So maybe.
Can we go back to Genesis?
Can we go back to Genesis? Okay.
You have one quote, I think earlier it says, man shall have dominion. I think that's the translation.
Right.
Over the animals and everything else. And dominion could be fiduciary responsibility. It could mean a whole bunch of things. It doesn't mean it's how you rule.
Okay.
As opposed to, as opposed to doing whatever you feel like.
Right, so I'll get to that, thank you. Because what we have in Genesis is the idea that you shall rule over the fish and the birds and the animals and so on. And given a positive spin, that rulership is positive. Because what it means is you are a benevolent ruler, not a ruler like you are in total control, because God is the one who is in control of nature. But we are stewards, essentially, of nature to serve and preserve the environment. The challenge is that as soon as you separate yourself as a steward, the steward, even if you are a benevolent steward, by separating yourself from the world around you, you instill the fear and dread. You immediately move yourself into a position of, I want to say more than separation. What's the word I'm looking for? Of less accountability, of justification of whatever you want to do. And we can challenge that later, which I will do, but I think there is a sense of why are we different? Saying we're different because we are given dominion, or we're given dominion because we're different, actually, I think, leaves us, it forces us to separate ourselves in a way that we are not so separate. If you've ever, for example, sat with a chimp and had a conversation with a chimp, you realize you're speaking different languages, even if you're behind a glass cage. There's an extraordinary place in the south of England called Monkey World. And we actually went there on my birthday, which is December the 14th. Nobody goes there in December. And so, because it's bloody cold. But you can go right up to these creatures and talk to them. And you can converse with these creatures. And it's quite extraordinary. And suddenly, the idea that you have dominion over them seems highly questionable once you've had that kind of encounter, I would say. So
take the other side.
Okay.
And say we're all like the animals. Aren't we just another predator?
Well, so what does that mean? If we're like the animals, are we a predator?
And we don't have no predator.
And so as we'll come on to, in some, there's environmentalism and ecology, which we'll come on to. And there is a perspective called deep ecology, which was brought about by Arness and others. And in deep ecology, which is different to the shallow ecology, in deep ecology, human beings are essentially a plague on this earth. And have superseded any kind of place in the ecosystems, in the entire Earth's ecosystem, so that we are more than just a predator, but a destroyer, a cancer, essentially, on society, because we have transcended our role to the point of irreparable damage. So there certainly are perspectives, particularly the deep ecology perspective, that says it's not just that we're a predator, but that we are actually responsible for total global change. The question is, in what way are we a predator? If you put yourself in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean by yourself with no tools, you're really not top of the food chain there. If you put yourself in the middle of the desert, you're not necessarily a predator there. So the question is, part of this involves the use of technology, and whether or not technology is an inherent part of human existence. But we may come back to that. Let's go to Maimonides, who's in the Middle Ages. Maimonides says in the Mishnah Torah, behold, this species, humanity, has become unique in this world, and there is no other species in this respect. that we by ourselves, with our own thoughts and intellect, shall know to discern between good and evil, and we can do whatever we desire, nor is there anyone to prevent us from doing good, or evil. So for Maimonides, what makes human beings essentially different from the rest of creation is free will, is choice. And we can choose to support ecosystems, we can choose to damage ecosystems, we can choose to elevate ourselves, we can choose not to. And he says that is totally unique in the whole of creation, that nothing else chooses.
My thought is if your basic bodily needs are met, you move on, including animals, you move on to another level of existence. And not having food or water can make you quite savage.
So that's an interesting way to look at it. So having, there are 1 billion people in this world who don't have, who are malnourished, who don't have access to proper food and water. Do we turn around and say that they act in a different way, don't have choice? I don't think so. I think everyone, the essence of humanity is in part, as we'll see, to think in abstract thought and to think in larger thought, to sacrifice and so on. And yet at the same time, there are clearly animals that behave in different ways. Elephants mourn, for example. Monkeys carry around the dead on their backs sometimes as they mourn. So, but are they doing that because they're choosing to, or because it's an instinct? So I think, I hear you when you say you have to have your needs met first. But I think even in the depths of humanity, when people are suffering and starving, we still make choices that I think, certainly according to Maimonides, makes us profoundly different from the rest of nature. Let me press on a bit with some other sources, and then we'll stop and take questions at the end of this section. So yeah, we've got it here. That's interesting. Oh, it's been explained. There we go. So more of Maimonides. It's been explained with utmost clarity that man is political by nature, and that it is his nature to live in society. He is not like the other animals, for which society is not a necessity. Maimonides isn't saying that animals aren't social. What he is saying is that human beings must be social. And so this really comes from a very strongly Jewish perspective, because in Judaism, we don't have mystics who go and live in caves traditionally. Shimon Bar Yochai might be an exception to that. The idea of separating ourselves off to find God is anathema to Judaism. And so Maimonides is really reflecting Judaism as opposed to humanity, perhaps, saying that human beings need society, whereas other creatures don't need their own society. And you can absolutely question that. I have no problem with questioning that. By the way, I've put at the end of this presentation, at the end of this sheet, all of the non-primary sources. So when I mentioned, for example, Friedman, I really hope I quoted Friedman in here. Wow, really? Oh, here we are, Richard Elliott Friedman. This is from The Hidden Face of God. In the Bible's picture of creation, men and women are understood to share in the divine in some way that animals and plants and stones do not. And essentially, Friedman is absolutely right that animals don't pray, stones don't pray, except we're going to come to a perspective where they do, where their very essence is a prayer. But they don't have theology, that snails don't sit and discuss the concept of a soul and so on. Now, you can turn around and say, but how would we know? Just because we don't speak snail. And there are biologists who will turn around and say, it's literally not capable of that thought because of how the brain works. So is what makes us different the fact that we have a brain shaped in a particular way? Is that enough for us to consider ourselves different? Because what does it mean to be different? Obviously, a snail is different to a bird. And so different here in Jewish perspective has tended to be higher, better, or superior. We'll come to that shortly. If that's the case, how do we differentiate? Is a bird better, higher than a snail? Some people might say yes, because it has the ability to think in different ways. Does that make a snail better than a sponge? What does that mean exactly? If you are creating a hierarchy, then you do end up with potential difficulties. Certainly, Friedman says, at least, even though there is no one Jewish way of thinking, the predominant way of Jewish thought is human beings have God. Human beings relate to God. Human beings pray. Human beings are aware of something greater than ourselves. And that may be a difference that is noticeable, that we are aware of the concept of the universe. We are aware of the concept of being. And it may be, as far as we can tell, it may be that the rest of creation isn't aware of being aware. And that's really Abraham Joshua Heschel, if nothing else. Heschel talks of radical amazement, not just the amazement, not just the fact, the wonder of existence, but the wonder that we can wonder about existence. And it seems that the rest of creation doesn't do that. Green says, I have to scroll down, excuse me. Judaism has always taught a distinction between humans and other forms of life, a sense that the human stands beyond the vegetative and animal realms out of which we emerge. Each creature embodies the life energy and hence the presence of the one, but only humans are called God's image in our tradition. This means that we are the first to have the mental capacity to recapitulate the process, to be self-conscious about our roots within the one. God creates all the other species at the very beginning of Genesis and says, and the Torah comments that it was good, where he told. It's only when human beings are created on day 6 that it says very good, tov ma'od. And so there seems to be a difference in kind, an idea that God is absolutely involved in all of creation. That is essential, that they don't just exist as tools for us, that everything attests to God and to God's creation. At the same time, there is a different level in Jewish thought regarding our relationship with God and the fact that we are created in God's image. And almost all commentaries will say that is why we have the power to create. So, for example, we might make art. We might, as the rest of the animal kingdom does not necessarily make art. We can make tools, and not just use tools, but construct tools. And that is different. A crow can take something and use it as a tool. That's different to constructing a tool for the, seeing the need for the tool and constructing the tool for it. Usually, the idea of being created in God's image is seen as the ability to create or to mold the universe in a positive way. I believe it is also very specifically the opposite. So in our prayers in the morning, the traditional prayer is that God who makes peace and creates all, but actually the biblical quotation is God who makes peace and creates evil. God, we tend to see in our society, we tend to see the move towards order, and that the essence of the human being is creating order out of chaos, just as God creates order out of chaos at the very beginning of Genesis. Everything is tohu vavohu, formless and void, and then God shapes it and creates order. I'll come to you in a few. Give me a few. So God is the one who takes that dangerous creative chaos, the erev, and brings it into being, into order. And so we human beings are given the task of maintaining that order. And that's why we have halakha, that's why we have Jewish law, that's why we have all of these things to help maintain order, to keep things distinct and separate. Whereas I would say, actually, the essence of the human being is also to be the destroyer, to be the opposite, and that we have to balance both that positive, creative element and that negative destroyer element. Because God also destroys. God wants to destroy very regularly in Torah, actually. Every time God gets really annoyed, for example, with the flood, God says, that's it, I'm going to wipe them all out. The Israelites come out of Egypt and they worship a golden calf. God says, that's it, I'm going to wipe them all out. There's even a midrash, a really fascinating midrash, of the 972 generations. That God creates the universe and it goes all the way to Sinai, and God says, do you want Torah? And the Israelites say, no, actually, that seems like a lot of hard work, thank you very much. So God destroys the entire universe and starts again. And God does this 972 times until, in this world, in this universe, God turns, and God's learned God's lesson, and instead holds the mountain over the heads of the Israelites and says, okay, I give you a choice. You either accept it or you will die here. At which point the Israelites, our ancestors, turn around and say, that seems like a great idea. We'll accept your Torah. Thank you very much. So God is destroyer as much as God is creator. And if we look, for example, at the second law of thermodynamics, that says that everything eventually in a closed system breaks down to entropy, it's very easy for us in our everyday society to look around and see order and design. But actually, everything eventually ends up in the exact opposite. And if we bring that into our theology, I think that changes our Jewish practice profoundly. Because we don't want to celebrate being destroyers, because that could be a terrible thing. But there is a balance between being the creator and the destroyer that I think is really important. So Art Green talks about connecting to God. We have the ability to connect to God as a way of God brought us out of this chaos and the generative power of God, that we are created in God's image. I question this and actually think what that does, the idea of God only being creator, I think is a reflection of our society in which we view progress as particularly technological progress or social progress, as opposed to saying that we have the power for both, like the two yitzers, the two inclinations, the power, the inclination to go above, to transcend, to create, or to destroy, and to follow the natural order, which is for everything to break down. So let's look at one more. This is Martin Yaffe's book, Human Beings. Oh, actually, wait, before I do, I want to share a little comment. Maria Meiss, in her extraordinary book, Ecofeminism, which is by Meiss and Shiva, Meiss says, industrial, capitalistic, patriarchal society is based on fundamental dichotomies between man and nature, man and woman, city and village, metropolis and colony, work and life, nature and culture. And I call these dichotomies colonizations. And I think for me, just picking up on Maria Meiss's words here, we have to go beyond the simple binary that really restricts us. And I understand, and I wrote a thesis on this and presented on it 10 years ago here, that Judaism has always been based on binary opposites. Day, night, man, woman, kosher, unkosher, holy, profane, light, dark, and so on. But the world isn't that simple. And so very often when we break things down into these polar opposites, we end up justifying how we treat the rest of the world. And usually from a hierarchical model, it's either A or B, which is usually upper and lower. So for example, when I say day and night, most people would say the preference is for the day. If I say kosher and unkosher, most people will say the preference is for the kosher. If I say holy, unholy, it's not just equitable, it's actually hierarchical. So similarly, when we get to man and woman, you can say, and again, in the biblical perspective, it's not just one or the other side by side, it's hierarchy. So the more we split the world into simple binary dichotomies, the more we tend to colonize and oppress the world. And so therefore, seeing ourselves above nature, man and nature, and I'm specifically using man there, man and nature, you could say, well, we're set apart and we have special abilities. We can connect to God, and they have other abilities like sonar and the ability to swim in the oceans and all of these abilities. But in our mind, actually, what we're talking about is upper and lower. And that leads to profound challenges later. Let's do this one, then I'll take some questions. Human beings often are called partners with God in the work of creation. In this view, the world is unfinished, and human beings are empowered by God to complete God's work. Jewish tradition asserts that the world was created essentially for human benefit. Judaism does have an anthropocentric view of the world, its relation to humanity and to God. From this perspective, Jewish concern for the environment is fundamentally utilitarian. Human beings must preserve, protect, and not squander the environment in striving to attain the goal of creating the kingdom of God upon earth. Nature is precious as a creation of God. It is not sacred in and of itself. Humanity's relationship to the earth also reflects its primary concern with morality among humans or between humans and God, rather than our ecological morality with the earth. I think there's a lot here, and I want to just unpack it a little quickly. Firstly, the idea that the world is unfinished and we are empowered to complete God's work. In the traditional Jewish thought, there is chaotic nature and there is domesticated nature. And so the lion, for example, is threatening nature, nature that is outside. Ultimately, the ultimate human hope, according to Judaism, is the Messianic age, when the wolf lies down with the lamb, and so on. Because suddenly all of chaos nature has become essentially domesticated nature or peaceful nature. Our role in traditional Jewish thought is to bring morality to nature, which is amoral, not immoral, but amoral, which seeks to destroy and so on. So we are partners with God in perfecting the world. But perfecting the world doesn't mean helping support each species. It actually means basically making lions good. And that's a little bit harder to do. It's a sort of unrealistic vision. But again, this idea that God is the one who gives order. I mean, we said it in our prayers this morning. God who renews creation day by day. Each day, chaos we risk chaos impinging upon us. And God says, no, right? Stay back, darkness. I've got you for another day. But what that does is that sets up this idea of chaos or disorder being bad. And so what that does is that removes us, I think, from the generative process of the earth, which is not just to build up order, but then to go into disorder. And from that disorder to build order again. You know, we didn't just come from nowhere, we came from pre-existing things that had died. And so actually having a process of life or Jewish perspective on life that holds the creation of order and the creation of disorder would be a very different Judaism. And I think would lead us to be much more in contact with the earth and the earth's cycles than it would what we have at the moment. And this idea that the world is fundamentally utilitarian, we preserve it, we protect it, but ultimately God gives it to us to protect. And so you have different commentaries, some of which say we should protect like a benevolent ruler. Others say that means mine it, kill it, do whatever you want with it. God has given it to us. Now, that second perspective is definitely a minority perspective, but it is definitely a real reading of, or an authentic reading based on this idea of hierarchy. And I think it's fascinating when we talk about sin. There are two kinds of sin in Judaism: bein adam lachavero and bein adam lamakom, between a person and another person, and between a person and God. And that's the theological system which the rabbis set up based on the way we view the rest of the world. Because why isn't there a third version of sins between a person and person, between a person and God, and between a person and the earth? And that's not just some hippie ecological thought, because you have a triangle of relationship in the Bible: God, the earth, and Israel, in particular, the people. And so God that punishes the people through the land or rewards the people through the land. We have a threefold relationship. It's not that God just punishes and says, that's it, you die or you live forever and so on, but we are punished and rewarded through the land. And so therefore what we have is fascinating, that the sin system, the system of where we can go wrong in Judaism has always been between people in society, because we are the real society, not the natural society, or between us and God, who is in some sense removed from society. But there isn't that third aspect, which I think is really important. So that's the end of that section. So let's open up quickly to questions, thoughts and comments, and then we'll go on to the next section.
I'll bring up what I was going to say before. You talk about entropy and chaos, okay? But obviously, if you look at the universe, the physics view of the universe, things are in a way getting more organized. We started with something you couldn't see right after creation that we may never see, then hydrogens form, stars form, higher elements form, animals form, we build bookcases, we build buildings, and if we disappear tomorrow, you know, the chimps might come up with something, or crows might come up with something, or maybe even octopuses would come up with something similar. That's what I believe anyways.
Right.
What is that that fights the chaos, fights entropy? What is that? Explain that to me.
Well, so that I think is where, for me, is where wonder comes in. And I do think there is a role for bringing in religious awe there. I remember the first time, actually the second time, the first time which was a tiny bean, the second time we saw an ultrasound for Zafra, and looking at the spine and the heart, and it makes no sense. How could that much order come from that much chaos? The challenge is that we tend, and I think there's a very nice optimism to that we see order get built up. But eventually, let's take the bookcase. Eventually, that bookcase will break down. Eventually, every human body breaks down. Eventually, we will have the heat death of the universe where everything breaks down.
Yeah, half-life of a proton is what, 800 trillion years?
Sure, sure. But I think that's one of our challenges, is that our theology tends to be, of course, so earth-centric, because it's what the rabbis knew. Now that we have a different understanding of the universe, our theology has to change. Now we have a different understanding of our place in the universe. Our theology has to change. And even if we are thinking on timescales that are so beyond what we can possibly imagine at the moment, I'm not saying that we have to change our theology within the next 800 trillion years. I am saying that the awareness of order coming from chaos, I think is too limiting. I think being able to hold order and chaos together, and in bringing that into our theology, life and death, as made evident in this world, which I appreciate is limiting, because this is the only world we know where there is any kind of life at the moment. I think that becomes an essential part of this. And Asha has a question, and then Jan wanted a question as well. So, and then Cal. You've got to be super loud. Come here now. Come here. Don't be embarrassed to ask questions. Is this a whispered question? Yeah, okay. No. Okay. Jan, you had a question before.
Yeah.
Has it gone? If it's gone, it's okay. No, he's good. He's good.
Okay. So, does Judaism support the idea that a spark of God resides in all of creation?
Yes, absolutely. The spark of God is in all of creation because all of creation attests to God having created it. Or the fact that there is life, the fact that there is any order shows something other than, now, something creative. Judaism deliberately separated itself from paganism. Paganism sees God or gods in everything, that the trees are gods, essentially. Judaism deliberately separated itself from that, but in so doing, I would suggest, went too far and separated itself from the natural order and said, it's in society and in the soul that you find God. Later, Hasidism, for example, returns to this almost pantheistic perspective of finding God in the world. So, yes, there is a divine spark of creation, but I would say creation isn't just chaos to order, but more than that as well. Let's take a few more questions, then I realized there's no way we're going to finish in time. So, go on.
I've been reading Rabbi Harold Kushner's book, Nine Things I've Learned About Life, whatever it's called. And I'm very interested in his argument about God's relationship with nature and the environment and its limits, because his argument is that while there's beauty in nature, there is so much terror, because he's witnessed so many natural disasters and wars, and sort of witnessed to the victims of these like, God cannot be responsible for these. And I'm curious how, when we try to switch to more of an ecological perspective, as you are arguing in our theology, how we kind of appreciate both the creation and the destruction of it while acknowledging the suffering.
Thank you. You reminded me of an important moment. I was a student rabbi at Edgware District Reform Synagogue. Rabbi Neil Kraft, of blessed memory, just passed away. It was very sad. He died 2 weeks before he retired. Rabbi Neil Kraft was teaching a class. No, I was teaching a class of high schoolers, and I invited him to come in on where do you find God? And he said, I find God, for example, in the spider's web, when it has dew on it, and you see that in the morning. He says, that reminds me of the order and the beauty of this. And I said, if you don't mind me asking in front of the other students, that's a death trap, right? That's literally, you see beauty in the thing that kills, and that kills another part of creation. And I remember he sat there like, yes, I guess. And I think that's where, I think that interaction for me was really important in terms of, we tend to view death as a negative thing. We tend to, choose life, and God gives us life in order that we celebrate life, and it is a gift. But death, especially in our society, we fight death as opposed to embracing death. And our theology, particularly rabbinic theology, says, it's okay, you never really die. Because as soon as your body dies, you keep going. And you live on in the presence of God. And I take, for example, Harold Kushner in his book, Who Needs God? Which is an unfortunate book, because if you read the spine, it says, Who Needs God? Harold Kushner. He talks of life after death, and he talks very clearly about the concept of olam haba, the world to come. And he says that's how the rabbis always called it. There's olam hazeh, this world, and olam haba, the world to come. And the rabbis imagine that as another world to come. Kushner says, no, it's this world to come. And so you live on in heaven, if you really want to use that, if you've made this world a better world. And you live in hell, or whatever you want to call it, if after you die, this world is poorer because you lived in it. And that leads me to an interesting thing, which I'll share, which I'm trying to be careful how to write, that essentially none of us get to heaven. Because what is our impact on Earth now? Is our impact positive on Earth? We can save a snail, we can reduce our carbon emissions. Is the world better for us having lived in it? Is a really interesting question in terms of how do you define better? Are other people better? Maybe we save other human lives and so on. But have we walked on this earth in such a way that the entire earth is better for us being in it? That, I think, suggests a very different way of living and being. So I appreciate the Krishna here. Noah raised their hand. Noah, and then I'm going to move on to the next section.
Yeah, I was very struck by you saying that God is envisioned as removed from nature, and I actually ended up checking the Torah that I have. In Job chapter 38, it says, then the Lord replied to Job out of the tempest. And, in Genesis, he creates a flood. And in the very beginning of this book, like the inciting incident is this forbidden natural object that gets violated. So there does seem to be a very strong association between God and nature. And I was wondering what you had to say about that.
Thank you. I'm going to disagree with you. God speaks to humanity through nature, but God has to be God, because God is incomprehensible. God has to appear through the medium which we know. So therefore, God speaks out of the tempest, but God is not in the tempest. It's the same as Elijah, that God is not in the earthquake or in the fire or in the wind, but God is in the still small voice. And in Job, which you refer to in that chapter, God says, where were you when I laid foundations to the earth? God is separate and other than the world itself, but God can only appear to us through nature. So similarly, when the rabbis ask, why does God appear to Moses in a thorn bush? Of all the kind of bushes, why does Moses appear in a thorn bush? And the answer that they give is, if God appeared in any other bush, you'd ask the same question. Which is that it's not specifically a thorn bush, it just happened to be a thorn bush. God has to appear in nature in order for us to relate to God. And this comes into, and I appreciate you mentioning this because this helps me, the idea of kavod Adonai, the glory of God. The glory of God fills the tabernacle, as we get to in a couple of weeks' time in our Torah portion. The glory of God fills the tabernacle so that Moses cannot enter. And the question is this a physical entering, or is it, as most rabbinic commentators understand, it is too beyond the natural being for Moses to even enter? It would essentially undo him. So the closer that you get to God as the mysterium tremendum, to use Rudolf Otto's phrase, the closer you become to undoing or unbeing. And so God is being, but God, or no, we can only experience God through that which is, as opposed to experience God in God's fullness, which is why, for example, in last week's Torah portion, Kitisa, Moses asked to see God's face, and God says, you can only see my back. You can only see the effects, essentially, of me. And that's where a lot of people would say, that's the world around us. That's God's back. That's where we can see God. It's a great question. I really appreciate this. Aware of time, aware that in an hour we've covered 3 pages of 13. So this is why it's taken me 14 years to write it, but, oh, and Cal had a question as well. And then I really must press on.
Just 3 points of clarification. So we must have nature because God communicates to us through nature.
Right.
And then to have creation, you had to have simultaneously chaos and disorder sort of balance things out, I mean, almost a dialectic. I mean, it must be that way, to have chaos and disorder, to have order.
Okay.
Is that correct?
In a Jewish perspective, yes. God creates order from disorder, yes.
And then then there's always the question, and people have asked this with just another person or in a larger sense, sort of, is my life better off with or without this person? Is the planet better off with or without people? Which is sort of what you were implying earlier.
And the deep ecology perspective, which I referred to before, says the world would have been better off had we not been made. And that does remind me of a rabbinic text, which says exactly that. The schools of Hillel and Shammai are discussing this. Is it better that we existed or not? And one school of thought says, yes, of course it's better that we existed. The other school of thought says, no, it's better that we wouldn't have existed. And they finally conclude, they agree, it would have been better had humanity never existed. But since we do exist, therefore we have to, reflect on our ways and our actions. So interestingly, I've never thought of that before. Interestingly, that midrash really picks up on the deep ecology perspective of actually it would have been better had we never existed. But we are here, so there's no point, debating that much further. Now we need to at least make our impact as little as possible.
So what you're saying is that people need the planet to survive and exist. The planet doesn't need people to thrive and exist.
And there are ways, we have to be really careful, because it's very easy for us to turn around and say that everything that we do on Earth is negative to Earth, and that's not the case. That we can actually take that which exists and bring more life to it. If we believe that more life is better, that in and of itself is an interesting question, actually. Is life what makes our planet good? So in landscaping, we can take hills that were essentially barren and bring life to them. So we can provide positive impact. The challenge is how much of an impact. What human beings can do, which no other species does, and this is in one of the sources on page 4, I think, is we can transcend climates. Most species are limited to a particular climate, even if they, migrate between climates. They do so deliberately to lock themselves in to a particular temperature. Trees even migrate. Forests migrate. Trees themselves don't, but the forests do according to temperature. Human beings can live in the hottest deserts and in the coldest climates using our own technology. So that makes us profoundly different. So then the question is, what's the impact? Because if we weren't here, we wouldn't, everything else would be locked in its own climate. Everything would be part of a larger system, whereas human beings seem to transcend that system by saying we can live anywhere. And we're the only species that really isn't locked into climate. So I would say we are at least different in that respect.
So life certainly makes the planet unique.
As far as we know, life makes our planet unique, yeah. Let's move on. So we're never going to get through all our sources, that's okay. Page 5. Let me scroll down. So uniqueness and superiority. Does different mean superior? Let's start with Kohelet, with Ecclesiastes. And I want to thank Bo Keppel for really bringing Ecclesiastes to my awareness for this book. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. In the morning liturgy, in the Reform movement in England, we include a prayer, which is not in our Siddur, that says, even our superiority over the animals is nothing. So we may be superior in the sense of can transcend climate. We may be superior in the sense of we have language or are capable of abstract thought. We're clearly not superior in terms of the ability to fly, although you could say with technology we can fly higher than any other animal and so on, and technology is part of human creation. Sure, you can say that. We can mimic a lot of what the animal kingdom does. At the end of the day, we're still going to die. And Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, reminds us that superiority, if we are superior, we still are bound by the same limits. And limits are really important, because limits is what leads us to ecological thought. Ecology is very much about human beings in their ecological system, which must necessarily be limited. Aristotle says that plants exist for animals and animals exist for humans and so on. Aquinas says it's not a sin to kill the animals. We're all there. They're there for us. As soon as you believe in superiority, it's very easy to believe that everything else below us exists for our pleasure, for our value. And so I think it's really important for us to try to move away from that perspective and to remind ourselves that all have the same fate. Adam, go on.
The first commandment, be fruitful and multiply, and later Noah populate the earth. And so the thing is if that's the first commandment, you have to make trades with nature, and you have to interact with nature, inventing fire, doing all kinds of things to populate the earth. So this is sort of a big giant trade-off between being in the world today and then how you react to it, because otherwise that didn't happen. There would have been no human race.
So Peru, Uruvu, Umulu, Haaretz, go forth, multiply, and fill the earth. I have an entire other chapter on that. The question is whether or not that is actually a mitzvah. It was taken in rabbinic tradition as the first mitzvah, and the mitzvah, therefore, of the most importance. That above anything else, go have Jewish kids, was the rabbinic understanding. It may, in fact, be part of the covenant as opposed to a mitzvah itself. I would say we have had a tendency to ignore that second clause. We say, go forth and multiply. That's the role. But the second part, umilu et haaretz, fill the earth, we may have done that already. And we may have done that many times over. Because what does it mean to fill the earth? It means to live within our boundary, within our limit. And so the question...
The limit 1,000 years ago, the limit was very narrow. Now
Correct. So that's why I have a totally separate chapter on this, because the idea of multiplying becomes a mitzvah up to a point, and that leads us back to, were we good on earth? And so what's interesting is we are seeing many more young Jews turn around and say, it's a mitzvah not to procreate because we have filled the earth. Or it's a mitzvah for us in our society, which is the most planet-damaging society. It's a mitzvah for us not to have children while not imposing on others that they cannot. So it becomes, the whole population question is a fascinating one. Let me press on, if I may. Talmud Bavli from Sanhedrin 38a. Adam was created on Shabbat Eve, so that if a person becomes haughty, God can say to them, the mosquito preceded you in the acts of creation, you were last. Here's how we normally read the biblical account, that God creates, and then God creates the sort of environment, then God creates the species on which everything depends, like the trees and plants and herbs and so on, and the grasses. Then God creates the next level up, and then God creates humanity. And so therefore, humanity is at the top of the chain. We read that often sequentially. Of course, it's interesting when we read that sequentially, because what's the actual order of creation when it comes to humanity? Man, then woman. So it should actually be that woman is the top of created order. So it's interesting that when we read that sequentially, suddenly we forget that part. But this midrash tells us if you can read it sequentially, but you can read it the other way round, which is things that came first were most important. So if a person turns around and says, yes, for my sake was the world created, you can actually turn around and say, no, even the mosquito was created before you. It's more important in creation than you are. And this isn't the only time this is mentioned. In Leviticus Rabbah, if a person merits, say to them, you preceded the entire act of creation. In other words, if a person's really depressed, say to them, hey, it's okay. You know, you were, that should be, you succeeded the entire act of creation. Everything was created for your order, for you, basically. If not, you turn around and say, the gnat preceded you, the worm preceded you. Everything that you think is lower than you actually beat you in the race. And so it's better than you. So there's an interesting assumption on the way we read the text sequentially. The book of Proverbs says, go and learn from the animals. Go to the ant, you sluggard, continue her ways and be wise, which having no chief, overseer or ruler, interesting, provides her bread in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. What's fascinating about the choice of the ant is the lack of sense of individualism in ant colonies. And what's extraordinary is that ants will gladly sacrifice themselves for the good of the colony. And so you see these extraordinary things where ants are floating downriver in these piles, these ant piles, because they couldn't be in one place, a fire or something like that. They go into the water, they float down the river until they find land, and the ones that are still alive come out and set up a new colony. And the ones that are underneath know they have a different sense of identity. They die as individuals so that the larger colony, which is an individual, survives. And it's fascinating to choose, of all the creatures to choose, Proverbs says, go and learn about that sense of how to be without necessarily your individualistic identity, and see how rigorous they are, see how they are in the world. You may think you're superior, but look what the ant does, because it's awesome. Similarly, Talmud says a very similar thing. Had the Torah not been given to us for our guidance, we could have learned modesty from the cat, honesty from the ant, chastity from the dove, and good manners from the cockerel. Now, you can debate this, especially cat owners can debate whether or not cats teach you modesty, but that's a whole separate discussion. We can do an entire Torah study just on this one line. At least good manners from the cockerel is the cockerel only crows as the sun comes up. It doesn't wake you up early, it wakes you up at exactly the same time, right? It's not rude in announcing itself and so on. But the idea here is that learn from the rest of nature. You think you're so superior, you have a lot to learn, and they can teach you things. Let me just get to the end of the page. Rabbi Tanchum, let me just scroll down. Rabbi Tanchum Bar Chia said, the descent of rain is as great as the giving of the Torah. The giving of Torah brought joy only to Israel, whereas the descent of rain brings joy to all the nations and to all the world, including to beasts, to birds, to wild animals. As it says, you visit the earth and water it to greatly enrich it. Think about it for a moment. Shavuot, the festival of receiving Torah. That's what our entire rabbinic endeavor is about. We take out the Torah scroll, we read from Torah. It's God's way of talking to us, God's way of revealing to us. Midrash says, yeah, sure, but that's just to the Jews. God reveals to the rest of the world through rain. God nourishes Israel through Torah. God nourishes the rest of creation through rain. And I think there's a very interesting element here, which is how much Israel, the Jews, have separated themselves from nature. That our rain is Torah, whereas the rest of the world, it's actual rain, it's actual nature. It's fascinating. As we take the Torah scroll out, what do we see? It's a tree of life to those who hold fast to it. Not an actual tree, right? That is the tree of life for us to hold fast to, but God's word written down. Even the things that we have, that revelation isn't through the natural world. Our sustenance is through the natural world. That's our physical sustenance. Our spiritual sustenance isn't. It's through something else. And you can turn around and say, yes, because as we saw before, animals don't have spiritual sustenance. They just have physical sustenance. Okay, I understand that. But the idea that every time it rains, it's greater than the giving of Torah, the central moment in Jewish identity and being that goes from creation, revelation, and redemption. You can't have that redemption without the revelation. Midrash turns around and says, yeah, a good rainstorm is better than that. And I think that's a really important, not only text in terms of how it divides us from the rest of nature, but how it reminds us of the importance of nature, to get out of our closed buildings. This morning in the service, I said we were singing Nishmat Kol Chai, the breath of all life sings praise to you, O God. But we couldn't bloody hear it because we were in a building with all the doors and windows closed. And so it's fascinating that Judaism still celebrates and reminds us of the importance of nature, even when our traditional way of gathering and being and learning is by separating ourselves from nature. And then Maimonides, humanity is merely the most noble among the things that are subject to generation, namely in this netherworld. In other words, Maimonides is saying, it's all well and good, but actually it's just about nobility and our connection to God. That's the only thing that makes us different or better. Question in the back.
Yes, if you squint really hard, you might say that that rain is sort of implying an understanding of emergent behavior, which is the oldest greater than the sum of their parts. But is it really saying that? And is there any other indication that they had any understanding of emergent behavior?
I don't know that they do have an understanding of emergent behaviors, so.
Well, your answers are kind of, but not exactly.
Right. I'm going to have to think about that one.
Okay.
I have to think, thank you. Let's take two quickly.
But we pray for rain in the winter as we do.
Sure.
And do in the summer. That's part of nature. And that citation you have, that's because we're a desert people.
Right.
Because if religion was formed, let's say somewhere in the middle of the Amazon, they might have had a different concept.
But this is our big challenge, I think. The Torah is profoundly connected to the earth. Shavuot, the festival of Shavuot, is a harvest festival. I don't know if it's an overgeneralization to say none of us harvest. The fact that the harvest festival becomes reinterpreted as the festival of revelation, it goes from this world to the supernal realm. Similarly, Sukkot, we're kind of forced to live in a sukkah. We're forced to ground ourselves on earth. But then the Kabbalists turn around and say, well, really, what this is really about is the different sphirot, the different emanations of God. As soon as you get natural, we have a tendency in Judaism to take it from the natural and to make it cerebral. And that tendency to move away, when we say, maybe here's another way of looking at it. We pray for rain during the rainy season in Israel, not the rainy season here. And so our words are disconnected from the local ecosystem. So Tu B'Shvat is a really good time to plant trees in Israel. It's a really bad time to plant trees in Santa Fe. And that's one of the difficulties of this unifying cerebral Judaism, which takes us out of the experiential Judaism, which says our festival for trees, of planting trees, should be another time. But in an effort to connect ourselves to global Jewry, ironically, we separate ourselves from our part of the globe. Cal.
So there appears to be two interpretations of what superiority is. One is what comes with priority is responsibility, and you're supposed to protect things, take care of the earth, conserve things.
Right.
And the other interpretation is to impose and conquer nature and use things up. But of course, those are two diametrically opposed ideas.
Right.
So what do we do with it?
Yes, we live in that dichotomy. And maybe you can turn around and say that's the two different, Yeats says, the two different inclinations. That we have exactly that, I think. Exactly that. Is it dichotomy, or is it on a spectrum of where do we place ourselves in our behavior? And there are times, and I guess part of the question is as individuals or as a society as well. You know, it's very easy for us in environmental circles to say people bad, you know, people damaging to the environment and so on. But actually, it's only people in specific societies that are far more damaging than other societies. And those societies where people have a much less of an impact on the earth, sometimes their impact on the earth, their negative impact on the earth, is specifically because of our society and funding them to destroy particular rainforests, for example, to create palm oil forests, palm forests and so on. So, yeah, I think we're on that spectrum. There are texts that I provide, for example, on page 6 and page 7, which are about, they are non-Jewish sources, let me scroll down, non-Jewish sources about our place in the world. And very quickly, references to Darwin, and Darwin saying very clearly that this is not by design, this is accident. And just because we may be the most complex species, or rather the species with the ability to affect more species than any other species, which makes us superior or powerful, or however you want to say it, doesn't mean we earned it. We just happened to have it. And so there's nothing to be proud of, essentially, in Darwin's perspective. There's just what is, where we are. The Gork wrote in 2003 this lovely idea. Yeah, it may be true that a human being is a better mathematician than a monkey, so we're superior in that way. Yeah, we've actually landed craft on other planets, right? Which we say, well, that is amazing, that makes us superior. You go, or we're the only species to have littered another planet. That's another way to look at it. You know, Mars, interestingly, Mars is the only planet we know of entirely inhabited by robots, which is an interesting way of, we can turn around and say, isn't human space exploration amazing? You go, or this was pristine and beautiful in its own way until we got there.
Who's to say that the robots approve Mars? You don't know.
Well, who's to say the robots?
The robots approve Mars.
Well, so that's the question. Right.
Environment doesn't mean it's the best.
Right. So the question,
approve.
and this leads us into what is technology, and does technology improve or not? And what does it mean to be good? When God says it is good, is that before we found fire or created the wheel or that kind of thing? Can technology be good? I think it's a really important extra question. So, as Taylor points out, it is true a human may be a better mathematician than a monkey, but the monkey may be a better tree climber than a human being. If we value mathematics more than tree climbing, that's because of our society. That doesn't mean that we are actually superior, it's just superior in our society. There are things, and this has nothing to do with intrinsic value. So to say we are superior, of course we might say we're superior in our society, but as I said, drop a person in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and leave them there and ask yourself how superior they are compared to all the other species around. Drop a person in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and see how superior they are compared with everything else around.
You ever been alone in a wilderness
Right.
and run into a bear? You don't feel
Right.
very superior.
Right.
The very got a little pocket knife on you, and the bear, yeah, maybe your IQ's a little smarter than the bear, but not at that moment.
Right, there are a lot of things. I mean, it's what they say, move to Santa Fe where nature wants to kill you. And we fight back against nature. We hold off that chaotic or disorder. That's, in some sense, life in Santa Fe is very much like the sort of biblical perspective of life. That there is stuff here that can absolutely kill you, and wherever you go in the world. So it doesn't mean that we're superior. It's just we may be able to build a plane that flies us over the Atlantic, so we surpass that. Does that make us superior? Again, that goes back to technology and ethics and so on. It's Ralston, whose book, I have to say, it starts well and then gets really problematic later. He says human beings, this comes back to Cal's point, have little biological role in ecosystems. Humans are not important as predators or prey. They play no role in the food chains or in regulating life cycles. They are a later add-on to systems. And that's where, if you have the more humans, you overload a system, an ecology, basically, a climate, or a biome, essentially, so that we don't live in harmony with creation in the same way. We can, and there are times where you do see it, for example, at a time of plague, that human beings, just as all other species, grow and dip in terms of their numbers according to other species around, and they provide a balance. You have too many deer, you have too few of this, but then eventually there's too many deer, there's not enough food, and so the deer die out and these grow, and you have a natural balance. Human beings tend not to do that, at least for the last couple of 100 years. And so the question is whether or not we are part of an ecosystem. We have to be, but if we go beyond the limits of the ecosystem, and that's where then we have trouble, and that's where ecological thought comes in. So are we the superior species? I guess one of the ways that I look at it, there's a nice thing here about, not in terms of number, 28% of all living matter on Earth is beetle. Okay, 28% of all life on Earth is beetle. So, which led, who is it, British biologist J.B.S. Haldane to once say, God seems inordinately fond of beetles, right? There is so much life mass that isn't human, that how can we say we're superior if, for example, you turned around and said, look at the numbers? Because when people talk about environmental crisis, it is an environmental crisis in terms of the threat to many species. The profound threat is to the human species, more than any other, whether or not we will be able to continue in an Earth that is so different. Whereas many beetles will just see humanity, come and go, okay. And so in what way are we superior? Yes, you can put junk on Mars, but if you can't even sustain yourself and the ecosystem around you, then are you really superior at all? So part of me feels like an orchestra, that perhaps human beings are like the first violin in the orchestra. And for anyone who's been to an orchestra, that doesn't mean that there aren't other violin players. It's just the first violin is the one who works most with the conductor. The whole of the orchestra is seated, and then once the orchestra is seated, in comes the first violin. There's applause. They're the most impressive instrumentalist in their instrument, because if you ask the first violin to go and play the horn, they wouldn't be able to. But they are the one who the conductor works with the most, and everyone follows the lead of the first violin. If the first violin goes wrong, everyone else goes wrong, at least if they are listening and paying attention. And so you could say perhaps the conductor is God, the first violin is humanity, and the rest of the orchestra is the rest of the created species, except I might add that in this orchestra, every once in a while, the first violin stands up and shoots somebody in the orchestra dead, and then sits down and carries on playing. And I think for me, that to me is how I feel in terms of, are we superior in some sense? That if we are a part of creation, and if, as we say in our prayers, Nishmat Kol Chai, the breath of all life sings praise to you, by our very existence, in terms of the number of human beings and the level of technology which we have reached, we by necessity wipe out other species. We have to. We've gone so far beyond our ecological limits that we have to now. And so the entire orchestra is impoverished. You could, for a while, have just one violinist playing, but nobody really wants to hear that concert. You want to hear something much larger. And in a similar way, God creates the whole world and everything that lives in order to hear that symphony of sound, that symphony of life. Jan, then we're going to move on to shifting to ecology.
By saying we have to, implies that we have the will.
No, we have locked ourselves in a system of technology and a system of how we use the earth, where it is impossible now for us to exist without causing irreparable harm to the world.
You can still choose.
We can choose to minimize our effect without question. This is where I differ from most environmentalists. Environmentalism, and this is a simplification, but environmentalism says we can fix this problem. That if only we tweaked things, we could make a difference. So if only our fuel were carbon neutral, then we would be fine. Ecology turns around and says, but what's the connection? Because an ecological society has limits. An environmental society doesn't necessarily have limits, it has technical fixes. And ecology is now starting to affect environmentalism and has done so for the last few decades. So the talk of limits in particular. Nonetheless, I'm reminded of a story when a friend back in England, bought a brand new car, gas guzzler, according to British standards. And let me just be clear, I used to drive a car in Britain that did something like 70 miles to the gallon. And moving here, I was horrified, appalled, that there just weren't cars that did 70 miles to the gallon. And mine was low in the limit. She bought a car, which probably embarrasses my car now. She bought a gas guzzling car. And I said to her, the planet thanks you for your car. She said, what? I'm an environmentalist. I said, are you really? She said, yeah, I recycle. And I said, okay. And I thought, I can't ruin this woman's car and purchase of a car. But that's essentially how an environmental society models itself. That we cause damage and try to fix it in other ways. Even though, actually, most recycling, something like 95% of bottles that go for recycling end up being not recycled. They are often sent to China for landfill, or they're burned down. Because recycling of all the things, recycling plastic in particular, the first ever commercial for plastic recycling was created by the oil lobby, very specific. So you say we can do good, we can choose to do good, but only within certain constraints. And I would say our entire society, Western industrial economic society, is essentially damaging to the earth. And we can choose to minimize that. We can turn off lights. We can do what Al Gore says at the end of An Inconvenient Truth, right? He talks in that movie, which changed things for a lot of people. He talks about the fundamental threat to humanity and how our carbon-based society is essentially destroying the planet. And then at the end, during the credits, it says, here's how you can help. Turn off your light switches, turn down the thermostat, inflate your tires, and that kind of thing. And everyone leaves going, oh, I can fix the planet. But I think, given that Earth Day has now existed for 50 years, and there has not been a year since Earth Day started that the state of the environment has been better. Given that our society is more environmentally destructive now than ever before, and not just in not just in America and Europe, but across the world, based on the way that we cause other societies to pay off their debt by destroying natural resources instead, to feed our needs in our Western society. Sure, we can do our bit, and we are obliged, I would say, morally, to reduce our impact. At the same time, if we think on that larger sense of being, instead of the individual, but more like the ant, I'm not saying it's useless, but I guess what I'm saying is, it's like slowly pumping the brakes on the rig as it heads towards the cliff. It's still going to reach the cliff, it's just going to take longer to do. And so our role, I think, is to minimize the damage. And I do think we have a moral responsibility nonetheless. I have been saying for a long time, and one of the reasons that it's actually taken so long to write my book is because it's so depressing. Because I didn't want to be that voice turning around and saying, no, we're all going to die. Because, but that is what I'm saying.
That's what you're saying. You're way too pessimistic.
Well, so that's the question. So what is pessimism, realism, and optimism? Because if you talk to environmental scientists, they all say the same thing, which is that we are locked into feedback loops. And we are locked into the point that, you remember when we used to say we need to reduce carbon emissions by 50% by 2020. And all of us who were watching all of these, COP talks were thinking, they're never going to do it. I was invited to Copenhagen by Aubrey Mayer, the author of Contraction and Convergence. And he said, I think it's really important to have a spiritual voice there. And I said, they're not going to agree on anything. He said, I know, but it's important for us to go. We are already locked into dynamic feedback loops, which will change life on Earth and will increase the temperature of our planet between 2 and 6 degrees. I think we have a moral responsibility to at least stop it as soon as we can. We're still going to go off the cliff. The question is, how deep is the cliff? How far is the cliff? If you get to 10 degrees, that's totally different. So I agree with you. I actually think there is value in pessimism. I think there is value, not necessarily pessimism, I don't think that's the word. We in our society are invested in denial of the consequences of all of our actions. And I think we have to mourn. This is another chapter that I have written already. That compare it to the Titanic. The ship's going down, the question is, how many lives can you now save? That's where I think we have the responsibility. Because we can save innumerable species. We can change the way that we organize our society. We can't save everything. The Greenland ice sheet will melt. Hundreds of thousands of people who especially live on coastal areas, as the climate shifts, as the weather patterns shift, hundreds of thousands of people will die. Countless species will become exterminated. But we can still stop the worst. And I think we have to be able to move beyond denial and go into that period of mourning and actually say, let's mourn the loss, acknowledge it, live in it, and move beyond it. So I think part of that is, instead of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, how do we get the people on the life rafts? Let's take one more comment, and then I'm going to go back to the sources.
I agree heavily. I think what's really important when discussing this is we've been discussing a lot of individual action, and I very strongly believe in planning on systemic action. For example, we're discussing a carbon footprint, which was created by oil companies as just distraction. And as we discussed before, it is certain societies, certain people who are causing the vast amount of harm. And we have the tools, we have the technologies, we have the ability to reduce the harm, to limit the degrees of warming, as you previously discussed. So when we are thinking about this grieving and this pessimism, as we're talking about it, I think in terms of considering, it's not just the difference between ecological and
Environmental.
environmental, thank you,
Yep.
as a ecological perspective, because you have to, because when you bring in these solutions, that can be used in an ecological perspective. And maybe I'm not fully understanding your point. I think my understanding of ecology is less clear, and I would like to haven't read as many books on it, but like by creating like the systemic political change and pushing for things which is difficult because we live profits and greed and sin, all of that, whatever. One point, however, is, what was I saying? Gosh, why? Anyway.
It's okay, you're doing great, because what you're pointing out, I think, if I can help,
Yeah.
is, and maybe we can go on to what is ecological to help this. The larger social, what can we do? I believe that there is a deliberate disempowerment of individual action for individual change. I believe that's actually structured into the way our society has been organized. And so that means that we have a greater challenge in terms of how to affect change when it comes to, you know, I'm green because I recycle bottles, that kind of thing. So.
You're such a much better speaker than I am.
Oh,
Thank
bless
you.
you. Okay, let's look very quickly at page 8. I'm aware we've only got 15 minutes left. So let's just be clear on what is ecology. So there are rules of ecology, or the laws of ecology. They're not on the handout, but I'll share them. The first law of ecology is everything is connected to everything else. That means not a hierarchy, but more like a web of life. The second law of ecology is everything must go somewhere. What do we say? What do we tell kids when they have junk? We say, what do we say to them?
Put them in proper.
What do we throw it away?
Yes.
Throw it away. Ecology says there is no away. Now, it's really interesting when you look at early rabbinic writings. For example, they say if you have shards of glass and you need to get rid of them, wait till the muddy season to put them in the path so that the mud basically covers them. You think, oh my God, because what are you doing? Because eventually all that glass is going to come up and actually going to stab people. You know, they have a really strong sense in Talmud of away. Everything is, you can put things away because it was a much smaller society. So the first law of ecology is that everything is connected to everything else. The second law of ecology is everything must go somewhere. The third law of ecology is nature knows best. And this is an interesting challenge for us because in order for humanity to succeed as we have, the fact that we can live, the fact that we can be here right now in clothes, with food, safe from the environment, is because we have specifically gone against nature. We have gone beyond natural cycles. That is one of the successes of humanity and also one of the challenges of humanity. So it's an interesting challenge to say nature knows best, because ultimately in the short term we are able to be here, but in the long term the consequences of that is that nature will eventually bring balance in some sense. This is where James Lovelock brought in his thesis of Gaia, the Gaia hypothesis, that it is all essentially alive and will balance itself whether you like it or not. And the fourth law of ecology is there is no such thing as a free lunch. So what we say now, we can do this, we can gather this, I read, every Ferrari that is built reduces life in the future. Everything, and I think it's a bit extreme to say every Ferrari, every plastic tablecloth, right? Everything that we do, every item of clothing, everything that we do has consequences, either around the world today or at some point in the future. So these are the laws of ecology that's suggested by people like Barry Commoner, Garrett Hardin, and others. Now, everything is connected to everything else. Everything must go somewhere. Nature knows best, and there is no such thing as a free lunch. So let's look at, we'll do two more sources. The first from Rabbi John Rayner, of blessed memory. He taught me at the Leobet College. He says, or he said 20 years ago, 25 years ago, if we now ask whether this is a satisfactory philosophy of the relationship between humans and animals, we have to say two things. On the one hand, it contrasts favorably with the attitude towards animals that prevailed in the Western world until 19th century. Just to be clear, he's saying that the Jewish view is that we are different, but that we have responsibility, okay? On the other hand, the traditional Jewish view falls short of the most advanced thinking of our time, which, influenced by Darwinian and post-Darwinian biology, has stressed anew in a matter reminiscent of Kohelet, how much all living things, humans included, have in common. As Dr. John Launer wrote in a recent article in Manna magazine, we are the comparatively recent descendants of tree shrews and the distant progeny of bacteria. A fuller understanding of our connectedness to other life forms might lead us to reconsider our superiority. It might also prompt us to reassess our attitudes towards our multifarious biological relations. In other words, it's time to give up the idea of superiority, or to reframe the idea of superiority. Just because we are able to transcend certain natural limits doesn't make us superior, because nature will get us in the end. So the short-term gain becomes the long-term loss, and then you're not so superior. Or if your short-term gain causes the loss of so many other species or the breakdown of biodiversity, then how superior are you in that you have impoverished the world around you or the orchestra around you? People say, well, that was a great first violin player. It's just a shame they took out the whole woodwind section while they were playing. So then they're not such a superior instrumentalist after all. Joel Colville wrote, I actually found a very powerful book called The Enemy of Nature. And Joel, I understand those who do not believe that human beings are the enemy of nature. He certainly implies that human society, the way that we have structured it, is the enemy of nature. He says, society and nature are not independent bodies bouncing off each other like billiard balls. Therefore, the crisis is not about an environment around us, but the evolution accelerating with sickening velocity of an ancient lesion in humanity's relation to nature. To think in terms of such a relation is ecological thinking, which requires that we see the world as an interconnected whole. From this standpoint, we are part of that whole to which we connect as a natural creature whose relation to nature requires that nature be transformed. In other words, our human nature is to be both part of the whole of nature and also distinguished from it by what we do to it. This boundary is called production. It's this species-specific activity that defines us. And its outcome is the economy, the polity, our culture, religion, the way we inhabit our bodies. Thus, human life is complicated, restless, and full of conflict, as every intelligent person knows. We do not have an environmental crisis then, but an ecological crisis, in the course of which our bodies, ourselves, and the whole of external nature are undergoing severe perturbations. Since production is the key to human nature, the ecological crisis is also about what can be called the conditions of production. These include energy resources, technologies, and also the bodies who have to get to work each day. I guess what we're talking about here is, and I do want to go to another source, I guess what we're talking about here is the human being who says, look how much I'm able to eat. I'm continually fed. And the person turns around to them afterwards and says, only because you're chopping your arm off and eating it. Connecting us to the world in a different way. That we are part of and separate from. And we're separate from not just in our cleverness and uniqueness, but in our destructive ability that ultimately threatens ourselves. So therefore, we're not fixing the environment. Fixing the environment doesn't actually work. Fixing ourselves, that's a different matter. And ultimately that comes down to, touches on my sermon from last night, which was deliberately connected, about the dominant social matrix and the new social matrix. The way we lead our society, the way we build the tabernacle in the middle of the wilderness, which I deliberately framed yesterday as a positive thing, but could also be seen very much as a negative thing. That you don't, when people ask in the Torah reading, and it says, and all the gold, and all the wood, and all the cloth, and all the dolphin skins, you see, where the hell did they get dolphin skins from? You say, well, they brought them from Egypt. It's like, but why? Why not build the tabernacle out of everything that was there, that was living? Why schlep it all the way? It's almost mirroring today's society, in which instead of growing the food and fruit that is local, we say, well, we have to have that. And I want to acknowledge my own hypocrisy here. One of my favorite things to eat in the morning is a banana, right? I love having a banana in the morning, right? It's absurd to fly bananas all the way across the world, but I love a good banana in the morning. So let's be clear that I'm a hypocrite as much as everyone else, right? I'm not preaching from some prophetic thing of, you know, you terrible people, whereas I do this, because I like it. We remember, he doesn't, but we remember in our day when we were kids that you could only get food at certain seasons, right? That was just how our society was. Oh, look, it's strawberry season. We can eat strawberries now. Right? It's really important, because the way that we framed our society now is that you can get anything you want from anywhere in the world. And that separates us from nature. Similarly, our theology, the way we think about ourselves and the way we express it in our liturgy, I think is really important. So going back to Noah's point from earlier, Abraham, Joshua, Heschel, I'm going to do this really quickly on page 9. God is within all things, not only in the life of man. Why did God speak to Moses from the thorn bush, was the question a pagan asked of the rabbi. To the pagan mind, God should have appeared upon a lofty mountain on the majesty of a thunderstorm. The rabbi answered, to teach you that there is no place on earth where the Shekhinah is not even a humble thorn bush. This is really important. This is where we get into the really challenging stuff, appreciating that I have 6 minutes left. The most common name of God that we use in our prayers is Adonai, which means my Lord. It is a hierarchical relationship. I know there are certain people who loathe the Baruch Atah Adonai, blessed are you, my Lord, because that relates to the great chain of being. That relates to hierarchy. God who is above, God who is beyond, God who is greater than us, God who gives us a bit of power and says, now you look after the things that are below. Whereas there is another form of God, another way of understanding God, which is the Shekhinah, the divine presence that dwells within. The feminine presence of God. And I haven't mentioned patriarchy at all, but let's be clear that, I guess I alluded to it, that God, angels, man, woman, and so on, the great chain of being is essentially not just hierarchical, but patriarchal. And relies on the domination of men towards everything else. The Shekhinah, the feminine presence of God who dwells within all things, that's very different. The question to ask ourselves is, what would our liturgy look like? What would Jewish practice look like if we move beyond Adonai, if we move beyond Melech, king, ruler of this great chain of being? What would happen if God in 21st century Reformed Judaism was the God who dwells within? The God who is in all of nature, in the thorn bush and in the mountain and in everything that we see and experience. It profoundly removes us from 2,000 years of rabbinic tradition, and therefore is bound to have very serious objection. But if we continue to pray, Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, Lord, my Lord, we are locking ourselves into a hierarchy. We are locking ourselves into a way of being in the rest of the world that makes us better. We lock ourselves into the framework of our temple. And I love our temple building, just to be clear, and it's designed in particular ways you may not even know. There are 12 pillars to describe the 12 tribes of Israel. You may not have known that. There are 10 sections of the roof to mirror the 10 commandments. There are 10 sections on the ark to mirror the 10 commandments. You may not have known that, but it's all an artificial creation. It's a metaphor. And so what we have, fascinatingly, just like the Mishkan in the wilderness, is we've separated ourselves from that which dwells. We've cut ourselves off from the natural world in order to talk to Adonai, in order to talk to the God who is above, the God who creates order, sustains order, rules separately, as opposed to the God who dwells within. And so, Evan Eisenberg, very quickly, right at the bottom of that page, God is not absent from nature. God is not outside nature so much as unfathomably deep within it, the essence of nature. That is a totally different understanding of God. How do you have Yom Kippur? That's the day when most Jews come to temple, right? The regular Jews, because they come regularly once a year, right? How do you have that really important day of gathering people together if God is not the judge, the king, the ruler who judges behavior? Because that's what really brings people in. We're terribly sorry, oh God above. Please forgive us of our sins. We'll be back next year, and hopefully we'll be better people. The model of God as Lord, as ruler, is very comforting, because it takes away some of our power. It takes away some of our responsibility. All we have to do is once a year check in with God and say, are we still good? Please don't kill me. Right? The book of life and death, we grovel. We who have so much power to change everything are suddenly reduced to subjects in exactly the same way that we reduce the rest of creation to being our subjects at our whim of life and death. And so if that is the model that we are locked into, which I would suggest is an environmental patriarchal model. It's environmental because you just have certain fixes. If you come to services, if you engage in true teshuvah, in true repentance and atonement, if you say the right words at the right time, God forgives you and you continue. It's an environmental fix that, yes, does require changing ourselves, but it still is by necessity hierarchical. What could our Judaism look like if it were not hierarchical? Could we even have Yom Kippur? Could the High Holy Days exist? Because that's the risk of moving to such a radical new model of God, to be able to turn around and say, but then all our festivals are kind of predicated on this. And yes, you can lift up Sukkot and you can elevate that environmental festival to really connect, because the reality is how many of us actually do sleep in the sukkah, as opposed to come to the sukkah, say Hamotzi Lechem in Haaretz, we've done the mitzvah, thanks very much, now let's go back into the wall. What would it mean for our Judaism to be so transformed? Is it sustainable? Is it a model of Judaism that keeps people coming into services, that keeps people returning? So I'm going to round off there. Let's have just a few minutes of final thoughts, questions, and comments. You had a hand up.
People are stupid, I hate to say it, They want comfort, they want regularity. Why is the Catholic Church so much more successful, or Christianity and Judaism? It gives you simple answers to simple things. There are even branches of Judaism where you get simple answers to simple things. Most people, when it ultimately comes down, do not want to think a lot. I'm just talking about human nature. And so I understand this, what you're saying, and I agree with you. But to be a successful religion, whatever that means, it's gotta be simple. It's gotta appeal to the masses. You know, you gotta have simple answers. Why was communism so popular? It's a simple answer. Kill all the rich people and give them all your money. Everything would be perfect. Why is there simple answers to everything you can think of? So I think the Father, or you can call it the Mother God, doesn't matter. I mean, you've got a big old lady there that's gonna stomp on my head. I'll be afraid of her too. I mean, it's, anyways, that's just my brief comment.
So you just opened up many massive cans of worms. Like, why is the Catholic Church far more successful? Actually, I think there's a similarity. I'll be blunt, and I've shared this with my Catholic peers. Why is the Catholic Church so successful, and why was communism so successful? Because of the force of violence, not because people want simple answers. Because both were spread through profound violence, and those who disagreed were killed.
Well, there might be fear too.
Right.
Simple, too.
I don't think all people want simple answers. I think that's why Judaism continues to grow in this world. Although I do understand the idea of comfort. Also, we didn't have the mission to basically try to convert everyone else. I do think there is something to be said, though, for the fact that you mentioned Christianity in general. The spread of Christianity is because, and again, I share this with Christian colleagues, so I'm not saying anything that I wouldn't say elsewhere, is because it makes us feel good about what we do on earth. That ultimately it doesn't really matter. And all that matters is eternal existence beyond. And so therefore it avoids all the messy stuff. Especially when you get to the theology of, as I have discussed with one colleague recently, it doesn't matter how bad you are, God's grace brings you into God's presence in the end, even if you are ultimately transformed. And that means you can do whatever you like. You can be as evil as you like, and eventually God's grace brings you into goodness. And I think religion, therefore, can be used to comfort us in our worst excesses and worst behaviors in this world, and deliberately separate us from the reality of this world. And evangelical communities, for a very long time until very recently, took the biblical text of, behold, there is a new heaven and a new earth, to say it literally doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you do to this earth, because it will be recreated. Mother Teresa, who everyone praises as a saint, was the most unenvironmental person ever. She essentially held the same perspective. It doesn't matter what you do on earth, because the earth is only temporary, whereas life eternal is what counts. So I actually think what you mentioned about, I don't think it's that people necessarily just want simple answers. I think people want to not be held accountable, or don't want to, everything that we do in this earth, what we do in our society, we are deliberately removed from the effects of it. So when we see, for example, when we have bananas that are grown, let's take my banana example, bananas that are grown using particular chemicals that will poison the people who grow them. And we see this particularly with unorganic bananas, with normally grown bananas. We see the people we see the terrible diseases that the people suffer who grow them. But when we go to Trader Joe's, we are totally removed from that. And being removed from the consequence is a really important part of our thriving society. I think it's very often a part of our religion, as a sort of environmental religion. So that once a year we come back and go, yeah, I was really bad, thanks very much. but that's a different sense of
That's
being.
why Yom Kippur works, everybody comes, that's simple.
That's true, it is simple. Brenda hasn't said anything, so let's do Brenda
Well,
first.
I don't know if I'm fooling myself here, but when I go to high holiday services, and the words are Adonai, and I hear, I understand the hierarchy, but I don't think that way, so I feel it's like semantics.
I think I hear you. I think words create metaphors which create behavior. I think there is value in a wide variety of metaphor of God. I'm not saying we shouldn't necessarily sometimes meet God as Adonai. I am saying there is a difficulty in always meeting God as Adonai. With you, it's different because you're Ivrit, but for many Jews who don't know the Hebrew, the words, like when we translate Baruch Atah Adonai, we translate it as eternal or everlasting one, because that's where the Hebrew words come from, the letters come from. But the sound we give it is Adonai. Maybe that's a really important distinction. That seeing God as eternal or seeing God as omnipresent is a different way of being than God who is my Lord. But I do think the way that we frame our liturgy, the way that we talk about God, affects the way we behave. So therefore, the fact that we beat our breasts, the fact that why don't we come to shul dressed in shlochi clothes? Because we're standing before the king above the king of kings. In England, you used to wear top hats and everything, right? Why do we take 3 steps back and 3 steps forward? And we bow because we're in the presence of royalty, divine royalty. So why do we kadosh, kadosh, kadosh? Why do we go up on tiptoes? Because they're higher than us. And we're trying to elevate ourselves up as opposed to across. And I'm not saying it's always wrong, but if our main or if our predominant metaphor, even throughout the year, is of hierarchy and lordship, I think that changes things. Very quickly, 1, 2, and 3, and then we have to wrap up.
Any reference to Spinoza?
So,
because Spinoza talks about God is really the immanence of nature, and the way you find God is through studying nature and studying the laws of nature.
Right. So Spinoza is a pantheist who says God is the world is God. And what happened to Spinoza?
They banned him.
He got excommunicated. Like the hippiest Jew possible, right? Got excommunicated. Now, it may well be because his family owed the Jewish community a huge amount of money and they used his theology against him, but actually it was all economic. It's a very interesting history. Nonetheless, the opening of pantheism in Judaism was shot down. Hasidism, which is in the sources we didn't get to, Hasidism gets extremely close to pantheism. There's one article that I read that says dangerously close to pantheism. I may have quoted it actually. That Hasidism becomes dangerously close to pantheism, while the Mitnagdim, the people who we come from, I know it's here somewhere, become dangerously close to the opposite of removing God totally from the universe. It's here somewhere.
Page 9, I think.
Is it 9? Thank you.
Oh, no, 11, last paragraph.
Last paragraph 11.
Paragraph.
Yeah, similar. There's as the Hasidic Jews were like, go out into the world, commune with God, stand under a tree, and you'll experience God in the falling of a leaf, and so on. The Mitnagdim, from whom most of us descend, said, what are you talking about? This meshuggah, crazy hippie stuff, it's in the word. It's there. And our challenge, I think, is to find that balance. This is where Reform Judaism has huge potential power between finding God in the world and finding God in the word. And being able to see revelation as something other than natural, but also seeing revelation as something utterly natural. Thank you. Carol.
A strong case could be made that with our industrialization, we live in a very destructive, toxic, industrialized world. And it could also be said that it's all, by our evolution, it was almost natural. We start making tools, we start doing, and it was just natural for us to go away, and then where we are right now to keep going. It's almost irreversible. So is industrialization almost a natural process?
So this is the interesting part about that. An ecologist would say that everything that we do is part of nature, but some of it bends or breaks nature's limits and boundaries, and therefore transcends nature in terms of consequence, but is still a part of nature. And that is a really fascinating aspect of nature transcending itself or breaking its own rules. So there are a number of people who say humanity is nature made conscious. That's not a traditional Jewish perspective. That God brings in consciousness or connection and so on. But every table still has come from nature, and we have come from nature in making the table. So it is natural. Eventually it will break down. It's just there are different limits in terms of how long things take to break down.
So like we're saying now, we know now that each one of us have microplastics in our blood.
Yes.
And also another 500 toxins from fire retardation, everything.
Sure.
It's just there.
Yes.
I mean, it comes out in mother's milk now. I mean, it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. So what do we do with it?
Well, so I guess for me, I mean, I believe we have a moral responsibility to help human health. And the question is how. You know, it's one thing to turn around and say, fine, I just won't include this. I won't, you know, increase the number of plastics and things like that. But for example, the fact that we have refrigerators and that we put things in Tupperware, often to let them go moldy in their snack drawer, right? But the fact that we can helps us live our lives, helps us not to have to, you know, go out and hunt and gather and so on, and helps human society progress. So I think we mustn't lament human progress, but just have to be aware of the potential damage that it can cause individuals in that progress. Katie, then we have to wrap up.
I think we're out of time anyway.
Okay, so go on.
I have less problem with the hierarchy in terms of what's above me than what humanity does with thinking what's below. And one of the things, just very quickly, that I noticed in terms of some of the examples you gave were very anthropomorphic language about how we see ants, how we see dogs, how we see that. We do not know how they behave, we know based on our expectations. I mean, just recently with Lee's cat, we've changed a little bit of how we relate. The cat has totally changed in terms of how he's behaving. And I just think we need to be aware of the language. You were talking about the ant, the individual ant dying for the good. We don't know what that ant thinks.
Right.
So if thinking of a hive mind, if that's appropriate, because that's from science fiction, is even a way to look at it. And I think it's connected with how we look at what's below us, and so we can devalue and use it.
I really appreciate that. It adds to, and this helps me wrap up as well. There is a text called Perek Shira, which we studied in the Tikkun Leil Shavuot years ago. And in Perek Shira, every element of creation shares a song, its own unique song of God. And it's just our role to hear it. The one that resonates the most with me is the one of the frog. The frog says, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. The second line of Shema. And when I was studying this back in Bournemouth and teaching this back in Bournemouth, it dawned on me, why is that the case? Because what is the sound a frog makes? We normally say, ribbit. Right? Frogs don't say ribbit, right? But we superimpose upon them something which makes sense to us. Perek Shira superimposes this line, Baruch Shem Kavod, because if you listen carefully, what a frog actually says is Baruch, like that. But actually, Perek Shira, you're really helping me here, because Perek Shira, we say that we have to listen to the unique voice of creation, but then we impose upon that element of creation the voice that we think they're saying. And that's really helpful for me in particular, because when we're trying to learn another language, it doesn't help to superimpose our tones. So for example, the best word off the top of my head in Hebrew is shalom. You tell kids in religious school, what does shalom mean? I go, it means peace. It does it? Because it comes from the root meaning wholeness. And it means hello and goodbye, because you're wishing them wholeness and so on. It doesn't translate because it's a different culture. And maybe where I have previously elevated Perek Shira in terms of listen to the voice of everything, because we don't want to get rid of their score, their piece in the orchestra. Maybe they're playing a totally different piece of music, and us imposing a score on them limits them, and thereby immediately limits what we can learn from them and what we can learn about ourselves. So I really appreciate that in terms of that which is below. There's not necessarily a problem with that which is above, but if we view ourselves as superior, maybe the superiority isn't in the using and the way we potentially abuse or take out a member of the orchestra, but the way we force them to sit in the orchestra in the first place, and thereby lose the possibility of learning the fullness of them and of the connection to them. So maybe Perek Shira itself ends up being environmentalist in ecological clothing, because we're already determining the relationship as opposed to learning from each species what that relationship actually could be. So I really appreciate it. So look, thank you. We've run out of time. Security's got to head off. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your thoughts and comments. Please feel free to email me, rabbineil@gmail.com. If things filter through, email me questions, thoughts, comments. I really appreciate them. If you can help, just put the chairs back and just put anything food-wise, just get it in the fridge. I really appreciate that. And thank you again. Thank you for your thoughts and your comments. I really genuinely appreciate it. Yes.
We talked about
Much.
neuroscientists and biologists.
Thank you, everyone online as well. Give me a second.
Yes,
I'm going to end our Zoom meeting. Thank you, everyone online. One second.